Jesus said to them, "You are quite wrong, for you know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God." I want to talk today about the dangers of doctrine. I want to talk today about the dangers of doctrine. And when I say doctrine, this is what I mean for the purpose of this sermon. When I say doctrine, what I mean is this: teaching that's detached from its consequences. Doctrine is what happens when we care more about the idea of being right than about doing what is right. It becomes when we're more attached to proving that our opinion is correct rather than paying attention to what happens when we say these words and what happens to the people around us. Doctrine is when we get stuck on an idea and our being right about it matters more than anything else. Let me give you a trivial example, but you'll understand this. You ever been in a fight with someone? And you fight harder and harder in that midst of that fight, and at some point you can't quite remember why it matters to you, but you are determined to win. Early in my marriage with my wife, Rondecia, we got into a fight, and this one went on for hours, right? And you're going to laugh. You know we're both big sci-fi geeks. We both like Star Trek. We got into a fight about who would win in a fight, Captain Kirk or Captain Picard. For hours, we were fighting about nonsense. And this happens in the church as well. It gets real nasty when we wrap our confidence and our determination to be right up in the words of our faith. Whole churches have been divided over the question of whether or not we should worship God on Saturday or Sunday. And if you've ever been in those conversations, it gets ugly. Christians have divided themselves on this question of whether when we die, are we raised immediately into heaven, or do we lie in the ground for a while until Jesus comes back and brings us new life? Churches divided over this. Early in the life of the church, in the year 300, the entire church was divided, and it came to the point of blows, of fistfights over this, over the question of a single letter. They were fighting over the question of whether or not God and Jesus are homoousios, the same substance, or homoousios, with an extra I in it, meaning of similar substance. And church folk got in fights where they were throwing punches over this question of one single letter. That's what doctrine is when we care more about the idea of being right rather than doing what is right. And we get an example of it in the gospel today. Jesus is teaching in the temple, and he's teaching about the resurrection. And the resurrection was something folks were debating at that point in time. I've got to understand that when Jesus came onto the scene and was preaching to the people, the Jewish faith was kind of all in tumult. There were a whole lot of new ideas people were hearing, and they were trying to figure out, what does God want from us right now? And they were debating them. And this point about the resurrection was a big point of debate. The Pharisees, like Jesus, believed that there was a resurrection. The Sadducees said that there was not. And so as Jesus is teaching, the Sadducees come to him with this question. They think they've got a winning point. They think they've got an idea that can prove that they are right, that there is no resurrection, that when we die, it's done and over. Now, as I was reading it this week for the first time, I noticed two words there that completely changed my understanding of what's happening in this moment. Because I had thought that they were bringing up a hypothetical argument, right? You know, you do that in an argument where you're like, well, what if X, Y, and Z? Never happened, but what if? But that's not what's happening here. The two words that matter that I had never noticed before is that they say there, and you can see it in your handout, they say, there were 7 brothers among us. Which is to say, this is not a hypothetical. This is something that happened in their community, right? And they bring it to Jesus. And here's the story. I'm going to tell it to you again just because you really got to get your head around this. Under the law of Moses, if a man died and his widow was left and they had no children, by law, she was obliged to marry his brother if he was still alive. And the idea is that they would have children together, and those children would be named as the first brother's children, right? The first husband's children. Does it make sense? So that the idea is that you could say that he had not died childless. That was the law. So there's this woman. She marries a man. We don't know how they feel about each other, but the man dies. And so by the law, she marries his brother. They also don't have children. That man dies, and she marries down the line until she's married all 7 of the brothers, right? This happened in the community of the Sadducees, and they bring it to Jesus, feeling like they've got the absolute winning argument. So they say, in the resurrection, if they're all brought back to life, whose wife will she be? She married them all. And this is the way they put it. They all had her, right? And this is the thing that they're going to use to hammer Jesus to point, look, we're right and you're wrong because you can't answer this question. And I want you to notice in the midst of this idea of doctrine, they're much more concerned with being right rather than doing what's right. Because somewhere in the midst of it, they got lost in the sauce and they didn't think about their sister who had lived through this. And I want you to just think about that for a second, about this woman's life, right? She marries this guy. We don't know how they feel about each other. Maybe it was an arranged marriage. Maybe they fell in love. But this man dies. And so by law, she is bound, no choice in the matter, has to marry his brother. And then he dies. And it happens again and again and again, 7 times. And then she dies, childless and alone. Now, I've lost people. I know we all have. We all know the pain and sorrow of what it is to lose someone. But imagine this woman's situation, right? And what it feels like to live through that. Imagine the rumors that must have come up at this point, right? Because probably by the 3rd husband, right, people started talking behind her back. What's going on here? Why do these brothers keep dying? Is she killing them? Is she cursed? What's happening here? And she lives through all of that. The Sadducees' sister. And there's no sense of care or concern for her and what this would all mean for her. They become more concerned about being right than in doing what is right. And Jesus understands this. We can get very, very lost in the midst of this and get much more concerned about being right than in doing what is right. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't mean to say that facts don't matter. I don't mean to say that ideas don't matter. But Jesus lays out for us a standard about how we should measure our opinions and our beliefs, the things that we hold to in our faith. This lesson came from the 22nd chapter of Matthew, back in the 7th chapter, real early on, because he wanted to be sure the disciples got this. He said, beware of these teachers who come to you like wolves in sheep's clothing, right? That they speak all the good things, but inwardly there's ravenous wolves. And he says, here's how you'll tell the difference between good teaching and bad teaching. By their fruits, he says, you will know them. Or to put it another way, he says, you can pay attention. When you believe this thing, when you believe this idea, this belief, this doctrine, whatever, what happens in your life? How does it change the way you interact with the people around you? Do you engage in them with love or with disdain? He said, that'll be the kind of rudder that'll help you figure out what is true and what is false. We see that kind of mirrored in the Old Testament readings we heard today and throughout the Old Scriptures. You'll notice that this word comes up a lot in the Old Testament, reference to something we should hold to and try and lift up, wisdom. And the Old Testament wisdom isn't just about knowing what's true or false, but doing the right thing when you have seen it, right? Doing the right thing. So Jesus kind of challenges them about this, right? And he says, first, and you notice the thing that he says, in the resurrection, they neither marry, and then he adds this other piece, nor are given in marriage, right? As a recognition, I think, of this woman and the way that she was kind of handed off from one man to the next and had to make her way in life in the midst of it. Now, this isn't just a theoretical thing for us as Christians today, because, we're still busy fighting about our ideas and beliefs and opinions. This church of Calvary in the past has been divided over questions of doctrine of this, of believing the right thing, of saying the right thing, and how are we going to move forward together. Along the way, when we get so committed to being right, we are willing to throw anyone under the bus as long as we can prove, like these Sadducees, as long as we can prove that we were in the right. And just as it happened with the Sadducees, I'll say that all too often in particular, strangely in the way it happens, it seems like women are the ones that get thrown under the bus. And we can see this in terms of this question of doctrine of being right. The way, for instance, Christians are very happy to speak words of disdain for unmarried mothers, right? Or other folk who find themselves in complicated situations get thrown under because the question of this is what's right and it's what Jesus teaches. We can see within this church of Calvary ourselves and the Episcopal Church at large, the way our queer brothers and sisters get thrown under the bus for the question of holding up what is true and what is right. And Jesus calls us to a different standard. A standard of looking at the fruits of our teachings, looking at the fruits of our ideas that we uphold, and what happens in the way we interact with the people around us. Do these beliefs and ideas give fruit to greater love and life, or do they lead us to walk in the ways of disdain? Jesus mentions to them this thing, kind of lifts it out there. Think about this woman, the one who was given in marriage, and they kind of skip over it. So he draws their attention once more. These last words he says, God tells us about the resurrection, right? When he says, I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. He's quoting one very specific moment in Scripture, the story of the burning bush. That's where God says those words, right? This is a moment where God's people feel lost, like this woman, that they've been forgotten and left over, that there's no hope for them any further. And God speaks to Moses and says, I am the God. I am right now the God of your ancestors, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. They are not forgotten, and neither are you. These are the words that Jesus calls the Sadducees to remember, right? Remember, just as God saw your ancestors, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, you should also see this woman who lived in your midst and seems to have been forgotten. Jesus gives us this standard. When we're encountering the question of our beliefs, our doctrines, whatever you want to put it, our opinions and facts. By their fruits, he says, you will know the true ones from the false. And I bring this up because and then I'll finish out. Because these debates are still very lively. We see them in our Bible studies. We see them online. We see them all over the place within the debates of the church right now. About what it means to believe, how do we know the truth from the falsehood? And Jesus lays out the standard. By the fruits you will know them. Think for a moment as you consider this question. If I hold to this one particular doctrine, will it make me more loving with the people around me? Or will it make me more hard-hearted? And that will teach you the truth. By their fruits, Jesus says, you will know them. May we find the wisdom to live into that teaching. Amen.